While playing with blocks, the brother and sister noticed a horde of terrifying zombies standing right outside, but far from being afraid. They pretended not to see anything. After all, this was the 6th year since the zombie virus outbreak, and most of the world had been overrun by zombies. Only the siblings' villa remained unbreached. As for the zombies that gathered outside every night, the siblings had long since grown accustomed to them. After all, their floor-to-ceiling windows were made of bulletproof glass. The zombies outside simply couldn't get in. Moreover, in this post-apocalyptic world, the brother had honed exceptional survival skills. Every morning, he would set traps in the vicinity to capture the zombies attempting to attack them. But in this post-apocalyptic world where supplies are king, the most terrifying threat comes from that 1% of survivors living in this well-stocked villa. It was inevitable that many would come to vie for territory. That morning, as they were swinging on the swing set, a pickup truck drove up. Realizing the visitors meant trouble, the boy walked up holding a toy gun and warned them not to set their sights on the villa. But facing this young child, the man didn't take him seriously at all. Instead, he asked if there were any adults at home. Seeing that the boy wouldn't speak, the man had no choice but to back up and leave in frustration. What he didn't know, however, was that the boy's toy gun wasn't an ordinary toy, but a modified tranquilizer gun that could render anyone unconscious within minutes. The next day, they were playing outside their front door as usual, when the man from the previous day paid another visit, and this time, he brought a woman with him. They asked the boy where the adults in the house were. The boy said his parents had gone to town to search for supplies, but the man didn't believe the boy's story, because he'd been observing for several days, and knew there were only 2 children in the villa. To ensure his sister's safety, Jack had no choice but to invite them inside, but they immediately began rummaging through the house. They hadn't expected to find such a large stockpile of supplies. Afterward, they made plans to stay there long term. As night fell, they prepared dinner for the children early, but the boy hesitated to take a bite, fearing they might have poisoned the food. The man then asked Jack why he wasn't eating, but Jack replied with a strange remark.
It will be over before you know it.
When the night was deep and quiet, Jack took his sister to the safe room. Soon, the outside was swarming with zombies. Frightened, the couple quickly turned off the lights. At that moment, they were completely unaware that a sinister figure had already slipped into the villa. The next second, a noise came from where the girlfriend was. The man hurried over with his gun, only to find his girlfriend lying on the ground. And just like that, they vanished from this world. By the next morning, the brother and sister were playing outside, as if nothing had ever happened. Little did they know that another person had arrived outside. This man looked like a Native American, but since he had been a Special Forces soldier, he easily spotted the nearby traps. Just as he was finding these traps quite interesting, a little girl suddenly appeared before him. At first, he didn't think much of it, and simply asked the girl what she was doing there, but the little girl just stood there, grinning foolishly. Before the man could react, a tranquilizer dart struck him in the neck. Although he pulled it out as fast as he could, it was already too late. The anesthetic had already entered his system. Meanwhile, the brother and sister watched him from a distance. It turned out that this was the 6th year since the zombie virus outbreak. The boy, Jack, mistook the man for an intruder, but Dan explained that he wasn't there to claim the territory. He just wanted to take his gun and knife and leave. Realizing that the man didn't seem like a bad guy, Jack felt reassured and invited him inside. Upon learning that this man was different from previous intruders, Jack assigned him a daunting task: to get on the treadmill. It turned out that the villa generated electricity through the treadmill. Unexpectedly, just then, a zombie suddenly appeared outside the window. Dan rushed outside and blew the zombie's head off. When Dan returned inside, Jack asked him why he had killed the zombie. Since the glass was bulletproof, the zombie couldn't get in at all. But out of consideration for the zombie's youth, Dan had no choice but to electrocute it. Since Dan had powered the villa all night, Jack kindly let him take a shower. After his shower, Dan went outside for a stroll, and suddenly spotted a strange house. He was about to go inside to see what was there, but Jack stopped him. When it was time to sleep that night, Jack handcuffed himself to the bed, a foreshadowing planted by the director. At first, like the next day, Dan was awakened by footsteps outside. Seeing Jack run out with a toy gun, Dan followed him from behind. It turned out Jack had trapped a zombie. Dan tried to kill the zombie with a branch, but Jack stopped him with the gun. Little did he know that this very incident made Dan suspect something was wrong with Jack, so he secretly opened the door to that strange room, only to find the walls covered in scratch marks. Clearly, this place was meant to hold a zombie. Before he could even process what was happening, the sound of an engine suddenly roared to life. It turned out someone else had set their sights on the villa. At that moment, Jack also realized what was happening to the villa. Seeing his sister on the 2nd floor waving at him, Jack was instantly overcome with fear. Fortunately, at the critical moment, Dan had slipped back into the house unnoticed, preventing the intruders from realizing anyone was home. It was precisely because of this that Jack decided Dan wasn't a bad guy, so he returned his weapon to him, and with Dan's weapon back in his possession, he decided to leave the place the very next day. Before leaving, Dan asked Jack if he was leaving too, but Jack hesitated to leave, as if there were some unspoken reason holding him back. Just then, his sister's cries for help suddenly rang out. It turned out the girl had been kidnapped by the intruders. They thought it was all over, but the next second, a burst of gunfire rang out, and the 3 thugs were killed. It turned out Jack's mother, a professional assassin, had returned, although the intruders had been taken care of. Dan was unfortunately shot as well. However, to everyone's surprise, Dan didn't die despite such a severe injury. It was only then that the woman stopped hiding anything. It turned out that the zombies in this world fell into two categories. One type was mindless zombies, and the other was special infected individuals with healing abilities. Dan was clearly one of the special infected, but special infected individuals mutate once every so often. Once they mutate, they turn into mindless zombies. However, the timing of the mutation is unpredictable. It turned out that the reason Jack's mother knew so much was because Jack was also a special infected. This was why, when he went to sleep at night, he often restrained himself with handcuffs. Seeing how hard life had been for this family, Dan decided to stay and protect them. They thought a happy life was waiting for them. But that day, the puppy became terrified of Jack. It seemed Jack was about to mutate. To ensure the family's safety, the mother had no choice but to lock Jack in the small dark room. They thought Jack would be fine after a few days. But one problem hadn't even been resolved when another arose. That day, the little girl unfortunately fell to the ground. It turned out she had a congenital heart condition. Dan performed CPR for an hour, but the little girl never regained consciousness. They could only watch helplessly as she passed away. A few more days passed, and Jack returned to being a normal human. When the next day arrived, Dan said goodbye to the mother and son, as he had to head north to search for his wife. And so, only Lisa's son, Jack, remained in the villa. Little did they know that Dan would return soon. The forest was overrun with zombies, leaving him no place to hide. But as he ran back toward the villa, he discovered a group of intruders had surrounded it. Realizing these people were likely fighting over territory, Dan was determined to rescue the mother and son. As a former Special Forces soldier, Dan took the initiative. Using a cover-based approach, he took out 2 guards, and then quietly slipped inside the villa. But eventually, he was also targeted by the intruders' guns. Yet he didn't panic. Instead, he slit his own throat. It turned out Dan was a special infected with healing abilities, so his wounds healed rapidly. He eventually killed the remaining intruders inside the house. To survive, Lisa quickly took her son and hid in a safe room. By the time Dan awoke from his coma, a week had passed. The area outside the villa was now littered with corpses. The mother and son had already left the villa. It turned out that Lisa believed the villa was no longer safe, so she took her son and headed north, searching for their next refuge. In the story's conclusion, Dan packed his belongings and set off on his journey north, for Dan knew that if fate allowed, they would surely meet again. And so the film ends.